The alarm in my chamber screamed before I even reached my console, and that alone told me something had gone wrong with Subject 413. I am Vorin Kess, Warden of the Threnody Labyrinth, and in 11 years, I had never once heard that alarm during an active trial. It meant the maze itself, the structure that had broken the minds of 11 different species before this night, had detected something it could not classify. I ran the last 20 steps to the control deck with my hearts pounding harder than they had in years, and what I saw on the screen made me stop breathing entirely. The human was not lost. The human was not afraid. The human was standing calmly at a junction that had rotated 4 times in the last hour, holding a small gray stone in his hand, drawing something on the wall. 3 hours earlier, none of us believed this night would be remarkable at all. We had taken him from a lone cargo vessel drifting near the outer relay lanes, a hauler with a cracked engine seal, and barely enough fuel to limp home. His name, according to the ship's manifest, was Marcus Webb. He did not fight when our drones pulled him aboard. He did not scream when the containment field closed around him. He simply looked around at our vessel with an expression I mistook, at the time, for fear. I understand now that it was not fear, it was calculation. The Cabal had ordered the trial as a formality. A new species, recently discovered, physically unremarkable by every measurement our scanners could take. Soft skin, slow reflexes, compared to almost every predator species we had tested before him. No claws, no venom, no natural armor. My technician, a sharp young analyst named Elena Voss, actually laughed when she reviewed his biological profile. "This one will not last 2 hours," she said. "Look at him. He cannot even see in low light without assistance." I remember agreeing with her. I remember feeling almost sorry for him as we prepared the entry chamber, because in 412 trials, no subject had ever solved the Threnody Labyrinth. Some species tried to fight the walls themselves, clawing at the polymer until their strength gave out. Some tried to burrow beneath the floor, only to find the floor rewriting itself faster than they could dig. Some simply stopped moving after the 3rd or 4th corridor sealed behind them, curling into themselves, and waiting for the trial to end, their minds unable to process a space that refused to hold still. The labyrinth is not built like the primitive stone mazes of older worlds. It is grown from a living polymer that reads the neural signature of whoever walks through it, and it reshapes itself in response. A corridor that led north 5 minutes ago might lead east now. A dead end might vanish and become an open hall. A hall might narrow into nothing and force a retreat through a passage that was not there before. The maze does not simply test a creature's memory. It tests whether a creature can survive a world where the rules of space itself refuse to stay fixed. We placed Marcus Webb at the entrance and sealed the chamber behind him. For the first 11 minutes, he did nothing that surprised us. He walked forward slowly, one hand trailing along the wall, the way a cautious animal might. He paused at the first junction and looked in both directions for a long moment. Elena noted his heart rate on the medical scanner, unusually steady for a creature in his position, but nothing that concerned us. Then he crouched down, reached into his boot, and pulled out a small chunk of gray mineral. He had broken it off from the casing of a fuel cell we had confiscated from his ship and somehow smuggled past our search, though we would not discover that detail until much later. He pressed the stone against the wall and drew a short vertical line, and beside it, a small symbol none of us recognized. "He is marking his trail," Elena said, sounding almost relieved. "Primitive thread and string navigation. Every species tries something like this. The maze will erase it the moment that corridor reshapes, and he will be exactly as lost as the rest of them." She was right about the marking. She was wrong about everything else. 40 minutes later, the corridor he had marked folded into the substrate exactly as the maze always does, sealing the wall and opening a new passage in its place. I expected panic. I expected the same collapse we had watched from every previous subject. That moment when a creature realizes the space around it cannot be trusted, and its mind simply refuses to keep functioning. Instead, Marcus Webb walked back to that same junction, found the wall gone, found the new corridor standing in its place, and crouched down to study it. He did not look confused. He looked curious, the way a person might look at a puzzle they were beginning to enjoy. After a few seconds, he pulled out his stone again and marked the new wall with a different symbol. "He is not remembering the maze," I said slowly, watching the feed. "He is remembering how the maze changes." Alina did not answer me for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "That should not be possible for a creature without our sensory range," she said. "He cannot perceive the shift the way we can. He should not even notice the pattern." But he had noticed it, and over the following hours, we watched him build something none of us had ever seen a subject attempt. He was not mapping the physical space of the labyrinth, because he seemed to understand, faster than any of us expected, that the physical space itself was worthless. Walls that existed now might not exist in an hour. What he was mapping instead was the behavior of the walls themselves. Every time a corridor reshaped around him, he noted how long it had taken, which direction the new passage tended to lean, whether the air grew warmer or cooler near a section about to shift, whether a faint vibration passed through the floor moments before a wall folded away. Small details. The kind of details a creature only notices if it refuses to stop paying attention, hour after hour, without ever losing its nerve. By the 5th hour, the walls near every junction he had passed were covered in a growing language of marks, and Alina had stopped calling them primitive. He rested only when he had to, and even then, he chose his moments with what looked like deliberate calculation, always at a junction, always with his back against a solid section of wall, always facing the direction most likely to produce new movement in the corridors. He rationed the small amount of food and water he had carried in, with a precision that unsettled me more than anything else about him. Most species we tested either panicked and consumed everything within the first hour, or shut down entirely and forgot to eat at all. Marcus Webb did neither. He ate small amounts on a schedule only he seemed to know, and every time he finished, he returned to his marks on the wall, adding to them, refining them, sometimes crossing out an earlier symbol and replacing it with a new one when the maze proved him wrong. I called a meeting with the senior staff during the 9th hour, because by then, the numbers Alina was reporting had begun to frighten me. "He is not slowing down," she told the room. "If anything, his movement is becoming faster and more direct. He is spending less time at each junction, not more. He is beginning to predict the shifts before they happen." One of the older wardens in the room, a broad-shouldered veteran named Dorn Halvik, who had overseen trials since before I was assigned to the program, dismissed the concern outright. "Every species eventually breaks," he said. "This one will break too. Let it exhaust itself, and it will curl up on the floor like the rest of them." I wanted to believe him. I had 11 years of evidence supporting that belief. But something in the way Marcus Webb moved through the corridors told me this trial would not end the way the others had. At the 11th hour, the maze did something it had never done before in any trial I had overseen. It shifted an entire section of corridors simultaneously. A coordinated collapse and reformation meant to erase any trail a subject might have built across a wide area at once. It was, according to our engineers, the single most disorienting event the labyrinth was capable of producing, designed specifically to break the minds of creatures who relied heavily on spatial memory. We watched the feed in silence, as dozens of corridors folded and reformed around him at once, the walls near him glowing faintly as the polymer reshaped itself in a wave that swept through nearly a third of the structure. For a moment, even I expected this to be the end of it, the moment where his mind finally gave out the way every other subject's mind had given out before him. Instead, Marcus Webb stood perfectly still in the center of the shifting wave, his eyes closed, one hand pressed flat against the nearest wall. He was not watching the corridors change. He was feeling the vibration of the shift move through the structure itself, and I understood, in that moment, what he had actually been building over the past 11 hours. He was not memorizing a map of rooms. He was learning the rhythm of the maze, the way a person learns the rhythm of another person's breathing. When the shift ended, he opened his eyes, looked around at the new corridors surrounding him, and smiled. Alina turned to me with an expression I had never seen on her before. "He is not just surviving the maze anymore," she said quietly. "He is starting to understand it better than we do." I did not want to admit how right she was, but the evidence over the next several hours made it impossible to deny. He began moving through junctions without pausing to mark them at all, choosing directions with a confidence that should not have been possible for a creature working from incomplete information. Twice, he walked directly toward a corridor that had not yet shifted, but was, according to our own internal predictions, about to. Twice, he arrived at the junction just as the polymer began to reform, and instead of being caught in the shift, he simply stepped through the new opening the moment it appeared, as though he had known exactly when and where it would open. By the 15th hour, Dorn Halvik had stopped speaking in the control room entirely. By the 18th hour, even the junior technicians had stopped their idle conversation, watching the feed with the kind of silence usually reserved for events far more serious than a routine trial. At the 22nd hour, Marcus Webb reached a section of the labyrinth that should have been completely unreachable from the trial area. It was a narrow maintenance corridor, connecting to the deep structure of the maze itself, a passage that existed only for our engineers, sealed off from every possible path a subject could walk. There was no route through the trial corridors that led there. No subject in 412 trials had ever come close. He walked through 3 consecutive junctions without slowing down, without marking a single wall, moving with a calm certainty that made my hands feel cold against the console. When he reached the sealed maintenance passage, he stopped, looked directly into the nearest optical sensor mounted above the entrance, and pressed his palm flat against the sealed door. I gave the order to intercept him before he went any further, and a pair of containment drones moved in to redirect him back into the trial corridors. He did not resist them. He stepped back calmly, glanced once more at the wall beside him, and allowed the drones to guide him away from the passage without any sign of frustration or distress. Elena pulled up the readings from that section immediately, and what she found silenced the entire control room. There was a seam in the labyrinth's generation algorithm, a tiny flaw in the code that governed how new corridors formed, one so small that our own engineers had never noticed it across 11 years and 412 trials. Under a very specific sequence of shifts, a sequence that would only occur if a subject moved through the maze in exactly the pattern Marcus Webb had followed over the past 22 hours. That seam created a brief, unintended connection to the deep maintenance structure. He had not simply survived the maze. He had studied its behavior closely enough, over the course of a single trial, to find a flaw that generations of our own engineers had missed. We ended the trial shortly after that, not because he had broken any rule, but because the Cabal's protocol required immediate suspension whenever a subject approached restricted infrastructure. When the containment drones led him back to the entry chamber, he did not look exhausted or frightened. He looked, if anything, mildly disappointed that the trial had ended before he finished mapping the last section of wall near the maintenance passage. I met him personally when the containment field lowered, which was not standard procedure, but after what I had watched over the past day, I needed to see him without a screen between us. He was smaller than I expected, standing there in the harsh light of the entry chamber, his simple clothing marked with dust from the polymer walls, the small gray stone still held loosely in one hand. Elena translated for me, as I asked him the only question that mattered. How did you do it? How did you understand a structure built by a species with senses so different from your own? He looked at the stone in his hand for a moment before answering, and when Elena translated his response, the entire control room fell silent again. I did not try to understand the maze, he said. I tried to understand the mind that built it. Every system reflects the fears of whoever designed it. Your maze was built to break creatures who rely on memory, so I stopped relying on memory. It was built to punish creatures who panic when the world changes, so I refused to panic. Once I stopped fighting the maze the way it expected to be fought, it stopped being able to hide from me. Dorn Halvik, standing near the entrance with an expression I had never seen on his face before, asked him quietly what he intended to do with the stone he still held. Keep it, Marcus Webb said, as a reminder that no system is ever as perfect as the people who built it believe it to be. We released him under standard post-trial protocol 2 days later, once the medical staff confirmed he had suffered no lasting harm from the ordeal. Before he boarded the transport that would return him to his own people, he turned back toward me one last time. You should patch that seam near the maintenance passage, he said, before someone less careful than me finds it. And you should ask yourself why a structure this advanced was built to punish curiosity instead of rewarding it. The transport doors closed, and I stood there long after the vessel had left our docking bay, thinking about those words far longer than I wanted to admit. I have overseen 6 trials since that night, and I have rebuilt the labyrinth's core algorithm twice, patching flaws my own engineers swear could never have been found by a creature without our sensory range. Every new subject who enters those corridors now faces a structure far more advanced than the one Marcus Webb walked into, and every one of them has still ended their trial the way trials were always meant to end, curled and silent on the corridor floor, unable to comprehend a world that refuses to stay fixed. Every one of them except him. I sent a formal memo to every warden across the Cabal after that trial concluded, and I have never once been asked to revise it. It reads simply that no maze, however advanced, however carefully built, should ever be trusted to hold a mind that refuses to be afraid of it. Because somewhere among the stars, there is a soft-skinned, slow-moving, unremarkable-looking species that our scanners once dismissed as no threat at all, and every one of them, it seems, carries the same quiet, patient, unbreakable habit of finding the seam in whatever cage they are placed inside. I still keep the recording of that final conversation in my private files, the one where he told me to ask myself why our structure was built to punish curiosity instead of rewarding it. I have watched it more times than I would like to count, and I still do not have an answer that satisfies me. Some nights, when the corridors of the labyrinth stand empty and silent, I find myself wondering whether Marcus Webb ever thinks about the maze at all, or whether it simply became, for him, another problem solved and quietly set aside, one more small mark added to some far larger map that we will never be permitted to see. I hope, for the sake of every species that still believes its cages are unbreakable, that we never find out what that larger map contains.